This is Your Bird Story, a broadcast of bird stories told by everyday people about their interactions and relationships with wild birds in cities. This season is funded by the Voice for Nature Foundation. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Welcome, Greg, to the Your Bird Story podcast. Please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor. My name is Greg Garrett. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. I have been doing a project called Moshassuck Critters, which is a video project of all the wild animals that I can find in my community, which is a pretty decent sized city, but not like the one I grew up in, which is New York. So I've been doing that for 10 years. I've been the watershed steward for the Moshassuck River, where I do all my video, and some of it in the river and along the river. I've been doing that for 25 years. I've been the watershed steward for the Moshassuck River. I've been doing environmental work for over 50 years. I helped found the Green Party, ran the office of the Coalition of Environmental Groups in Rhode Island for about 19 years, retired recently. Seem to be spending most of my time doing videos of wild animals and also critiquing economic development policy from an environmental and a climate justice and environmental justice perspective, because I don't think you can make the economy work unless you have justice at its core.
And what does it mean to be a watershed steward?
Most watershed groups have somebody whose job it is, or volunteer job it is, to kind of look after the river and advocate for it. So Friends of the Moshassuck is a very small organization. It has a board of 9 people. It has a mailing list of 16 people. It survives on very, very occasional small grants to do little projects and doesn't really do much other than everybody who's on the board is encouraged to do projects. I was the one who founded it, and so I kind of pay attention to all the things that go on in the river, what lives there, what lives along it, what's going on in the communities. I mean, one of the things we're doing now, which we don't do much of, but we do when called, is there's a park about a half a mile from my house, but in the next town. I'm working with the community groups there to save this park from being turned into a parking lot. It's the only access point to the river in the whole community, in the whole city. It's a pretty good sized city, 80,000 people. It's the only access to that particular river. And basically, the city's trying to get rid of the park, doesn't want it. It's the only park in a low-income, people of color community. And, I'm working with the local leadership to protect this. And, the city's breaking all the laws. So that's part of my job as watershed steward, is to also advocate. And then I have to bring, my knowledge of economic development to critiquing this kind of stuff when they want to turn it into a parking lot.
So for the Moshassuck River, what made you interested in this particular river?
When I moved to Providence, I ended up living in the watershed. But what really got me going on it was I would go downtown. The downtown part of the Moshassuck is part of the old Blackstone Canal, which is some geological history that I think we can leave for another day unless you find it fascinating. You'd see that river and there were like things falling in it. There were trash in it. It was like the river clearly needed some friends. So I said, well, we'll start Friends of the Moshassuck. And it has always been an extremely low-key group. I mean, we've never really done a lot, but just being there makes people aware of it. And when something happens, we know how to be found.
We connected because we both listened to the same podcast, This Old Tree. For folks who don't listen to This Old Tree, I can't recommend it highly enough. I wanted to ask you, Greg, why do you listen to This Old Tree? What do you like about that podcast?
Well, I'll admit the first thing you should know is that Doug is actually a friend of mine, the guy who does it, Doug Still, and is a friend from doing environmental work and tree work. He was the city forester. I was running a tree planting program in a vacant lot that was overgrown by invasives that I actually, over the course of 20 years, have turned into a real forest. Of course, being Providence, now that it's a real forest, people moved in because there's just housing is ridiculous around here. And, but it's an amazing forest along the river. And so that's where I know Doug. And then he started this podcast, and I talked with him actually occasionally before he started it. And, he bounced some ideas off of me. I'm trained both in environmental science and in anthropology. So the connection to the communities and the cultures that he talks about in there is always fascinating to me. What the tree represents in a community and what trees represent in the community is very important. And if you go around the world, almost every place that has trees, there's like important trees in communities. Not every community, but there's an important tree in hundreds and hundreds of communities around the country and thousands and thousands around the world. Every place in the world has those kinds of places. In Ethiopia, the only places that have trees pretty much are the churchyards. They're walled off. And that's the center of biodiversity. And, for me, part of it is not only the trees and the communities, but, they're not, for me at least, not necessary for the podcast, is that biodiversity. I've always been into animal behavior, even growing up in the Bronx. When I got to school, it was like to study what I read it as a kid was about animal behavior. Studied it in school till I got thrown out. And figured out, kind of get thrown out because I realized that the professors were never going to do what I wanted. And eventually, when I was in grad school, I figured out that field was never going to have jobs anyway. So I might as well just go have fun. Spent the next 15 years living in the woods. And that's kind of really where I developed my affinities. I did live in the woods for 15 years after studying forestry. I've written a book about forests, about the campaign to ban clear cutting in Maine, which did not succeed, but actually changed the discussion enough because it basically pointed out for the people of Maine that they were running out of wood again. And the problems for their economy and future, if they ran out, were not just that the paper mills might close, but that the rest of their economy was endangered.
This is a podcast, so there are no visuals. Can you describe that for us?
This was a vacant lot next to the river of uncertain ownership at that point. I learned since that it belongs to the bus company, but it's too close to the river for them to build anything. It was Japanese knotweed, except for a gallery right along the forest and like one ailanthus, 50 feet from the river in the middle of this knotweed. And there was an abandoned park and basketball court. It was a weird land deal for this one anyway, but that's, the old corruption of Providence around real estate. So it was basically a field that was, one landscape architect described, the purest field of Japanese knotweed I've ever seen. It was just about an acre of Japanese knotweed. And I assume you're familiar with Japanese knotweed. It's 10 feet tall, invasive, nothing grows under it, hardly anything lives in it. I came to this place that right next to the river, there was some really big old trees and there was no knotweed under the trees. Now, I should have realized, but did not at that point, 25 years ago, that part of it was that these were Norway maples. And Norway maples just put out a lot of toxins and nothing will grow under them. But I thought maybe it's the shade. So I said, if I shade the knotweed with trees, it will suppress the knotweed. Came up with that on my own. Whether it's true or not, nobody could have told me back then, but it was worth trying. It turns out it's partly true. And the fact is that the trees are now 40 feet tall and pretty much a closed canopy. And what happens is the knotweed starts growing in the spring from the roots before the leaves come out. It gets about 3 feet tall, and then the leaves come out and it stops growing. So in other words, it makes the place at least passable because, with Japanese knotweed, it's impenetrable practically. Yeah. I used to actually bring youth groups down there once a year in conjunction with like the green teams of a groundwork program. And we would knock down all the knotweed without tools. We would just stomp it, and the kids would run somersaults through it, and we would just knock down the whole field of knotweed in about 3 hours. And so that was part of how we suppressed the knotweed, was knocking it down and giving the trees a chance to grow. And basically that's what we did. We planted relatively large trees. We had to pay like 60, 80, $100 to get trees. And so we only would plant 6 a year. And so it took us 16, 18 years to plant the whole field. And then we were done because we'd reached the end of the field. And we put in about 90 trees. So,
Okay.
6 trees, 5 trees, and considering the soil and stuff there, almost every single one of them is alive today. We had over a 90% take rate. One year we tried bare root trees and it was a drought and a couple of them didn't make it. Other than that, almost everything's made it. I started planting randomly. And so I planted from south to north so that the shade would follow the trees. And as the trees grew, more shade coming from the south. And it did work. And the place is all treed. The trees are beautiful. There's nice colors in the fall because I planted native hardwoods. It's an amazing forest. That I came up with doing that and did it on squatted land is pretty funny.
How have you used all the data you have collected through your videos in terms of advocacy? And do you think other people in your community use your work for conservation advocacy purposes?
I don't think that it gets used that much for it. Some of it does. And, occasionally I'll do something that's a little more advocacy and a little less birds. Like that field that they're trying to take, there's an osprey that nests there. So occasionally I'll use video of that and talk about the field or something like that. There's a lot of people in the community who are environmental activists who are on my email list and see it and love it. But, I don't know how many of them translate it directly into conservation work. I do, because I go to a lot of public hearings. And so the information I gather, both from doing the videos and also the additional observations I make of the environment in my community that, is related to keeping my eyes open for wildlife, does affect things. I've gotten enough awards for my environmental activism that when I show up at a hearing, the legislators and the people I have to hear know who I am already. They pay attention because I got a long history of making sense in ways that really kind of challenge them to change. I am an effective advocate. I'm, partly because I've been doing this for 50 years and stood up at important environmental forums at key times and made things happen. That's kind of how you do that. But it's really 50 years of work to get to the point where I am heard.
Yeah.
And I know how much easier it is for me, a college educated white guy, who's 70 years old.
One of the videos I watched, there was some question as to what would happen to that heron.
I did do further video.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the heron passed on.
Mm.
It seemed like at first it was kind of okay, but after about a month of it being around, it just started looking really shriveled up. And, within a couple more days, and the whole bottom of its leg had been severed, other than a little bit of skin hanging on. So I'm sure it was infected. I'm sure, that it couldn't have been good, and it must have been painful as all hell. So for a while, it seemed like it could hunt, but, a heron actually walks with 2 legs, but it could still fly. So it got around. It seemed like it occasionally caught something. I'm sure it was a much less efficient hunter. And so between the infection and probably not being able to hunt, and the weaker it got from the infection, the less it hunted. So what happened eventually is it just died. It died in the cemetery. So the cemetery workers, since the cemetery is owned by the city has a natural history museum in one of its parks. So that they sent the bird's carcass over to the Natural History Museum. I know the people at the museum, so I've been trying to figure out what they're going to do with it now that they've got this dead bird, and have offered them the use of my videos of the bird while it was alive.
I wanted to ask a question about your vision for nature in cities. I mean, we started out by talking about watershed stewards and your partnership with the neighboring town around saving a park which could have great access to the river. You've spoken about your wildlife videos in the cemetery, and these seem to be all part of a green vision for cities. And I'm wondering if you have an explicit vision, or is this something that's kind of arising as you get involved in different projects?
You cannot heal ecosystems without ending poverty. You cannot end poverty without healing ecosystems. And that's been my slogan for my quote unquote consulting business for more than 20 years. It's guided everything I do for the last 30 years.
I'm really glad to have this time with you today, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you back here next month.